like to begin with a text written down by two adherents of New Age spirituality in Israel about 6 years ago. This is a quote. "We deeply believe that we are our body, we are our money, we are our religion, and that God exists somewhere far up in the clouds, and we should pray to Him to get what we seek." Wrong. 7 exclamation marks here. You shouldn't pray to Him. You should pray to yourselves. Beg, ask, get down on your knees, persuade yourselves to listen to yourselves, bless and give yourselves plenty of love, kindness, joy, and happiness. This text is a prime example of the New Age belief in what may be termed self-divinity, the notion that each and every person's core essence is divine. The main upshot of this maxim is the concept of reality creation. That is, that a person creates any and all aspects of her life. A person may do so with insight and self-awareness, or it might happen out of blindness and misplaced interests. But in either case, the power of this core essence is all-consuming. If you are prosperous and fulfilled, it is because you chose to be so. And if you are sick and miserable, it also was your choice. But the interesting thing about this extremely self-empowering quote I opened with is that it was ostensibly spoken by no other than Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, or Da'ari, a prominent Kabbalist who lived in the 16th century. He didn't write that many books when he was alive, texts at all, but after his death he's doing really well now in Islam. It is a channeled text. It's brought about in a state of light trance in which the channeler, in this case a person by the name of Daniel Norel, is possessed by a non-material entity, in this case, Da'ari. Now, this paradox of power lies at the heart of New Age channeling, a form of possession preaching self-control. I find it to be a stable paradox, well suited for the middle-class ethos of channelers and the anxieties experienced in this age of liquid modernity and extreme individualization. The entities offer assurance and certainty that this ethos is the correct ethos. They offer certainty that this reliance on the self is indeed the way the universe is constructed, and assurance that every person has the capacity and abilities for successful self-reliance. Sociologically, though, it's more complex than that. Israeli channelers come from a secular background, where speaking with non-material entities and gaining assurance via metaphysical concepts is not acceptable. And so, I find that for many channelers, their career began with a single vision, a strong, unexpected conversion event that shattered some of their previous beliefs and introduced a somewhat new structure of beliefs in their stead. I call this phase of channeling wild channeling, to contrast it to the steadier, ongoing phase of cultivated channeling. In this talk, I want to briefly introduce wild and cultivated channeling, and to describe these two phases in the lives and works of 3 forerunners of contemporary channeling: Alice Bailey, Jane Roberts, and Helen Schucman. I am not claiming that their form of channeling nor its content are identical to New Age channeling as practiced today, but it is precisely because they were pioneers that their attempts at striking a balance between internal and external authority is especially illuminating, so to speak. In all 3 cases, struggling to understand the visions and thus establishing a stable relationship with the divine was crucial. And in all 3 cases, questions of personal versus external authority were at the heart of the equilibrium reached. Finally, one can see a gamut of 3 options presented here. Alice Bailey emphasized not only personal divinity, but also adherence to the transcendent masters. The American channeler Jane Roberts stressed inner infinity and completeness above all else. And Helen Schucman, the scribe of A Course in Miracles, brought through a very authoritative voice, one that brooks no argument, but at the same time spoke of each person being like unto a god. Let's begin at the end with cultivated channeling. It is, as mentioned, a stable phenomenon. It is under the control, and I'm talking about the contemporary channeling at the moment. It is under the control of the channeler in the sense that she is the one who initiates channeling, done either verbally or through automatic writing, alone or in front of an audience. The channeler brings through information. There is a distinct sense of being possessed by the guide, or rather, a lack of sense of self. From a phenomenological perspective, there are 4 key features to the experience of cultivated channeling. First, the information feels like it arrives on its own, and the channeler does not experience a sense of volition. Second, the experience lacks strong physical sensations. In fact, the channelers often feel disembodied. Third, the experience is pleasant and mild, easy to enter, easy to exit, and not taxing. Finally, it entails a certain amount of amnesia, with some channelers not remembering these information sessions at all, and others remembering only bits and pieces. Content-wise, the main message is one of infinite personal potential. Interestingly enough, even though phenomenologically the channeler feels he is not the one speaking the message, theologically the channeler is usually not interested in who is actually doing the speaking. Contemporary Israeli channelers, almost as a rule, are not interested in the nature of the entities bringing through the information. Some of them have even professed to me that they are not always sure which entity speaks through them at the moment, nor do they much care. If the message feels right, and if people find it useful, that is enough for them. This calm, self-assured manner does not characterize the relationship to the message and the entities within the first wild phase of channeling. Wild channeling often occurs during a life crisis, such as prolonged disease, romantic troubles, depression, death in the family, or many other physical and mental afflictions. And then one day, something happens. The content varies widely, but a sense of being compelled or ordered is quite common. This sense of losing control, the fact that no one else around them can see or hear their visions, and the intense nature of the experience brings many channelers during this phase to fear they are losing their mind. While channeling, unlike its cultivated counterpart, does not usually involve any form of amnesia. There is no suppression of a sense of self, and it is not pleasant. The channeler is very much there, involved in the experience, and he is there body and soul, with heightened emotions and strong bodily sensations. These bodily sensations include tingling, heat, cold, shivering, and a sense of being filled with energy. I'm just listing the features that I've seen repeated in many interviews. Emotions include surprise, a sense of urgency, and above all, fear. While channeling makes the possibility of communicating with non-material entities viable, but only potentially. In actuality, it lacks an organizing ideological framework, is too frightening, and entails a strong sense of losing control of body and mind. And so, channelers turn to cultivated channeling, which is under their control practically and makes sense to them ideologically. As they do so, the embodied nature of wild channeling wanes. They no longer hear a physical voice, nor feel currents of energy. And emotions become much calmer, making the experience of channeling mild and pleasant. It is some of the people who first formed cultivated channeling to which I now turn. For them, turning to pre-existing culturally mediated solution was not so simple. Alice Bailey was born in 1880 to a wealthy family in Manchester. Although her life was comfortable enough, she had a troubled childhood which included, so she claims, 3 suicide attempts, the first at the tender age of 5. She was 15 and visiting her aunt in Scotland when, as she says, at the height of my happiness and in the very middle of my dilemma and questioning, something happened. Quote, I was sitting in the drawing room reading. The door opened, and in walked a tall man dressed in European clothes, but with a turban on his head. He came in and sat down beside me. I was so petrified at the sight of the turban that I could not make a sound. 20 years later, in 1915, Bailey learned that this was the master Kuthumi, and that she has joined his ashram. That's her phrase. By this time, she is in the United States, married for the second time, and heavily involved in theosophy. But still, she kept her realization to herself. Until, in 1919, 4 years later, she heard, quote, a clear note of music, which sounded from the sky, through the hill, and in me. Then I heard a voice which said, there are some books which it is desired should be written for the public. You can write them. Will you do so? This was the Tibetan, also known as the Master Jwal Kul. I'm probably mispronouncing this in 7 ways, but she did so too, probably. So. Bailey immediately replied to the Tibetan's offer by flatly refusing. She was afraid for her mental and physical sanity. But the voice persisted, and she decided to give it a try. And within weeks, wrote down the first chapters of Intuition, Human, and Solar. This took place around December 1919, and by the spring of 1920, the wild has been already somewhat cultivated. Bailey no longer heard an actual voice at regular preset hours, but could now, if she concentrated hard enough, write down the thoughts of the Tibetan whenever she pleased. Bailey's attitude towards the book she wrote down was very clear, and she wrote many books for the Tibetan. I, she writes, have been strictly his amanuensis and secretary. The books, she adds, are his, not mine, and basically the responsibility is his. This does not mean, however, that Bailey advocated relinquishing personal authority. Within the Theosophical Society in Crotona, she was heavily involved in a battle between her own party, which represented what she termed a democratic point of view, and her bitter rivals at the esoteric section, who stood, she writes, for spiritual authority and complete control. I know it's more complicated than that, and there are many sides to the story, and all wrote about it, but this is the way she chooses to present it. That she was for democratization of theosophy, and everybody else was for control. She firmly believed in the existence of the hierarchy, but also in the necessity of establishing human projects to aid the advancement of the hierarchy's plan. In essence, she says that while listening to the masters is a good idea, it is certainly not required. She not only says so herself, but in an appendix to her very long and uncompleted autobiography, the Tibetan himself writes. There's an appendix where the Tibetan gives his autobiography, so to speak. In the Arcane School, no obedience is... The Arcane School is the school established by Bailey. In the Arcane School, no obedience is exacted, no emphasis is laid on obeying the master, for no master is running the school. Emphasis is laid upon the one master in the heart, the soul, the true spiritual man within each human being. Skipping ahead 50 years. If, within my own limited field of study, Alice Bailey marks one end of the spectrum, Jane Roberts marks the other. In the books she channeled for Seth, self-reliance is emphasized over and over again. There is no hierarchy. She would find the very word, with its implication of lesser people, abhorrent. And there are no masters to even consider obeying. And Roberts does not distance her opinions from those of Seth, nor does she see him as superior to him. Being currently non-incarnate, he has a better point of view, so to speak. But she, Seth told her, has been incarnated alongside him, alongside Seth, many times in the past. Furthermore, while the Tibetan may have objected to overly depending on outside religious authority, Seth is absolutely contemptuous of the very concept. Quote, of Seth, dogmas lead people into fanaticism rather than tolerance, fear rather than courage, dependence rather than self-reliance. But still, This creed of self-reliance came in the midst of a crisis. Robert's husband was miserable from severe back trouble, and while she herself just had a science fiction novel published, she was a science fiction published novelist, published 3 books, I think, before she turned to Seth. She was unhappy with the published book and could not come up with a new book idea. It was not a good year for them. And again, uncalled for and unexpected, something happened. In September 1963, Roberts, who was 34 years old at the time, sat down to write when, quote, "A fantastic avalanche of radical new ideas burst into my head with tremendous force, as if my skull were some sort of receiving station, turned up to unbearable volume. Not only ideas came pouring through, but sensations, intensified and pulsating. It was as if the physical world were really tissue paper thin, hiding infinite dimensions of reality, and I was suddenly flung through the tissue paper with a huge ripping sound." Within a few minutes, Roberts had written almost 20 pages of notes under the title of "The Physical Universe as Idea Construction." In order to investigate the source of this message, she and her husband decided to use a Ouija board. It was December, 3 months later, by the time they started the sessions. It took them 3 months because she said, let's at least make some money out of it, and they pitched an offer for a book, How to Develop Your ESP Powers, to a publisher, which accepted. So they never got past the Ouija board, though, in the book they wrote out, because what happened next. It was December by the time they started the sessions, and immediately contacted a rather dull spirit by the name of Frank Watts, a doctor who lived in Elmira 20 years previously. But by the second session, Roberts felt she received the answers in her head before the board spelled them out. And in the 4th session, the board suddenly spelled, "Consciousness is like a flower with many petals." Consciousness is takes a while with a board. The session became more and more complex, and when they asked Frank Watts what he meant, the board spelled, "I prefer not to be called Frank Watts." That personality was rather colorless. Seth has arrived, but only partially. Alike to Alice Bailey, Jane Roberts was afraid. By the next session, she was hearing them clearly in her head in a loud voice. As the impulse to speak them grew stronger, so did Roberts' determination to fight that impulse. But she felt compelled. Quote, this is a quote of Jane Roberts again, not of Seth. "The pointer began to spell out the answer. The pointer paused. I felt as if I were standing shivering on the top of a high diving board, trying to make myself jump while the words pushed at me. They seemed to rush through my mind. In some crazy fashion, I felt as if they'd back up piles of nouns and verbs in my head until they closed everything else off if I didn't speak them. And without really knowing how or why, I opened my mouth and let them out." Jane ended up having a very productive and stable relationship with Seth, but this took a while. She and her husband had close to 400 private sessions before she felt secure enough and in control enough, as she says, to share the knowledge with others. With Helen Schucman, with whom I will end my talk, such a gratifying and permanent equilibrium would never become an option. The Course in Miracles was published in 1975. Over 1,000 pages long, it has since sold millions of copies and translated to over 20 languages, including Hebrew. Unlike the Seth material, the Course uses a very authoritative tone. It does not argue or persuade, but directs the reader towards a single path. Here, for instance, is the opening paragraph. And this is not Helen Schucman speaking, this is the voice of the Course, as he is called. This is a Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take it is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can establish the curriculum. It means only that you can elect what you want to take at a given time. The authority of the Course also rests upon its claim that it was written by Jesus. Still, the course does not require obedience or surrender to a higher authority. Quite the opposite. It promotes self-divinity and reality creation. Or rather, it says that reality is an illusion created by each of us. And again, it's more complex than that, but this is the common realization about the course. Jesus may be Jesus, but on the other hand, we are all like Jesus. Again, the voice is speaking now. My mind will always be like yours, because we were created as equals. It was only my decision that gave me all power in heaven and earth. My only gift to you is to help you make the same decision for yourself. This seems like rather a stable arrangement, a divine and authoritative entity telling its readers that they are as divine and authoritative as he. But the author of the course, or rather its scribe, as she insisted on being called, was not happy with this arrangement. For her, for Schucman, writing the course was absolute torture. She did not want the job, and while writing felt, as she says, acute terror, bleakly unbelieving, suspicious, and afraid. Her name was Helen Schucman, as I said, and she was a professor in the psychology department at the Presbyterian Medical Center at Columbia University. So if anyone is considering another job after academia, it's an option. Schucman began scribing the course in October 1965, 10 years previous to his publication, at the age of 56, with the cooperation of her department head, Bill Thetford. When she first tried reading what she wrote to Thetford, she had a coughing fit that lasted 5 minutes. She stuttered, stammered, yawned, and sighed her way through the text. Again, all these physical reactions would subside with time. But unlike Roberts and Bailey, Schucman remained ambivalent towards the course throughout her life. To understand why, I would like to finish with an account of a dream she had about 20 years previous to scribing the course. This is from a very beautiful biography of Helen Schucman written by Kenneth Wapnick, her friend and cooperator, called also by the very beautiful title, Absence from Felicity. Highly recommended reading, really. Helen is sitting in an easy chair, sleepy and peaceful. But the source material is an unfinished autobiography that Helen Schucman wrote and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote like a dozen times and never published. Helen is sitting in an easy chair, sleepy and peaceful. A radio is playing music very softly, and then, without breaking the tranquility, her cousin Harry's voice comes over the radio and starts quoting from the Christian Science version of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, Mother God, all harmonious, hallowed be thy name. I will mention in passing that Helen's mother dabbled in Theosophy and Christian Science, or like Helen's father said, I'm never quite sure what religion she is at the time. He was not even agnostic, her father. He was just not interested at all. She was very interested, Helen. So, our Father, Mother, God, all harmonious, hallowed be thy name. Helen is mildly annoyed and hopes he'll stop. But the phrase is just repeated over and over again. Our Father, Mother, God, all harmonious, hallowed be thy name. And after a while, it gets even more soothing than the music. And Helen almost falls asleep. By the way, this dream is the reason I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. If I would read it while the shades were down, everybody would fall asleep. Then Harry calls out in a hypnotic monotone. Hypnotic is Helen's term. Helen, Helen, Helen. Just keep on listening to the radio, and the Lord God himself will speak to you, which is indeed what takes place. The voice of God whispers, you know, Helen, you're in a pretty bad way. Helen says she realizes this, but this source of nonsense hasn't ever solved anything. The voice, ignoring her, goes on. You won't have much chance, you know. Again, she agrees, but refuses that sort of help. Again, she's ignored. But it's so easy. Here you are after so many years of fighting a desperate and almost hopeless battle. There isn't much chance you'll get through all right in the end. Helen is not convinced, and the voice offers, just suppose for a minute that I could give you a strong power outside yourself, a power that would tell, with a capital P, a power that would tell you what to do and would solve all your problems for you. You'd be perfectly safe then, wouldn't you? You'd never even think about suicide then. Helen refuses to believe. It seems ridiculous. Even the phrase, our Father, Mother, God, sounds infantile to her. It's not real, and she won't have it. The voice offers one final question. Wouldn't she like such a thing to be true? Helen's determination falls away, and she quietly agrees that, yes, I'd like it. My God, yes, I'd like it. So now that's settled, the voice goes on. All you have to do is pick up those 2 little pieces of cardboard that are lying on the table beside you and slip them between your eyes and your glasses. Then just go off to sleep. That's all there is to it. Surely that's nothing to be afraid of. Helen begins to comply, but then throws the pieces of cardboard away and snaps herself into wakefulness. I won't do it. It's dark in this room and I can't see very much as it is. With these things in front of my eyes, I won't be able to see anything at all. I won't do it. The voice from the radio ignores her and keeps on chanting. And the fight Helen puts up against falling asleep under, she's asleep, but the fight in the dream she puts up against falling asleep under its persuasiveness almost, she says, splits her in half. For Helen Schucman, religion, even in the form of personal divinity, never became a viable option. She may have cultivated her wild visions, but she cultivated them for others, not for herself. She was a religious innovator that never found peace in her own innovations, and was always acutely aware that the paradox of power so many others found convincing remained still a paradox that required some sort of surrender, if only temporary, to external forces. Once, a friend asked Helen Schucman, how come the course brought peace for so many, but was ineffective for her? Looking at him, she said, I know the course is real. And after a brief pause, added, but I don't believe in it. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, folks. That was perfectly timed. We have a full 15 minutes. Yes, Olaf, please.
I have a question about the way you see these biographical and autobiographical statements, because as we all know, biography isn't documentary.
Yes.
And there's a big difference between seeing them as sources of their self-presentation or as being sources to different modes of channeling as they actually are carried out. So.
Oh, I agree completely. But I formed this typology, and we all spoke about the problem with taxonomies, about the wild and cultivated. Actually, after I finished my PhD, looking back at my materials, because it took me so long, because the channels themselves don't speak about the first phase. They kind of forget about it. They say, I had this wonderful experience, and then I wanted to replicate it, and I started reading, and I discovered Jane Roberts, and I discovered The Coastern Miracle, I discovered Sanaya Roman, J.Z. Knight, you know the names, and I understood what happened to me, and then I started doing it again. But after, it's when you cross the hour mark of the interview, people start telling you the truth, more or less. And I asked them about the experience again, and it was not pleasant at all. And this is a story that recurred over and over and over again. The physical sensations, the terror. They describe it as absolutely terrifying at the time. And then when later on, and before that in the interview, they said, I just wanted to have that wonderful. And you read the description, it's not wonderful, it's horrible for them. For them, it's horrible. But they kind of take that out of the story. So I know it's not an exact answer, but in their presentation of self, in their autobiographies, as they tell them to me, they downplay it really a lot. And only once I saw these categories and looked back at the stories of Jane Roberts and Alice Bailey, did I notice the terror. Because Alice Bailey and Jane Roberts don't speak about the terror. For them, it's not there. For them, it's only the good about the possession, and everything else that was bad was unrelated to the experience, to the conversion moment, if you want to call it that. Helen Schucman is a different story. I agree that you should take her story of skepticism with a grain of salt. But on the other hand, when you see her list of visions and dreams, and she has such wonderful dreams, really wonderful, wonderful dreams, if she was really working at creating herself as a skeptic, then she worked really hard. In the sense that all her visions are about being torn, in a sense, except the last one. And even the last one, she was struggling, or presented herself as struggling. So maybe we found Schucman, because she really talks about it a lot, and people around her talked about how she was this reluctant prophet. But with everybody else, they were not reluctant. I'm putting the reluctant into that because I see that in the story in the beginning, but they don't present it. Okay?
Margaret.
Fantastic talk. Super interesting, this distinction between these two moments. It's interesting how you can apply this retrospectively also to historical material. Perhaps the slight problem with terminology here is that channeling is so easily associated to the New Age that it gets a bit awkward to apply it to historical material. I think it works perfectly with Swedenborg, for instance. It would be interesting to play a little bit with this. One thing that I would be curious about is how this relates to what I would call, I noted it down because it just came to my mind, automatic creative action. Because very often you see how some of the persons who have these kind of experiences then produce something out of it. And it can be many different things. It can be a work of art, it can be a book, it can be music also. So, and that's why I don't say automatic writing or automatic drawing. It's because I think it's a kind of pattern that you have there. So how much of this do you find there?
Excellent question. I've been thinking about along parallel lines about art, because when I happen to talk with some musicians in a conference, I was stopping in a motel in America. It happened to be a motel owned by musicians, and there was a conference. And I talked with them because they had this, whatever. Throughout the night they jammed, and I sat in the background and thought that, my God, I should learn to play anything. And then speaking with them, and many of them said, this is exactly what I feel like channeling is what I feel like when I do music. Mm-hmm. They said,
improvisation from music, yes, very often is what, yes, for them is automatic writing.
And but I did not speak with them. And who I spoke with, the channelers in Israel, and who I looked at, the channelers in Israel and in the United States, which I know not as well, I know a bit, they don't do art as much as you'd expect. Well, maybe you wouldn't expect. They don't do art so much. There's two channelers in Israel who do singing. One calls it Lemurian singing, and she does Lemurian chanting that's supposed to promote health. I think all of yesterday that if you're a channeler, do not write a book about being healthy. It tends to kill you. Really, I know 3 examples. While writing a book about being how to become healthy, including Jane Roberts, died. So while she was doing this Lemurian chanting, she got throat cancer. So it didn't work so well, but she's okay at the moment. And there's another one, and there's one who did art, paintings, but that's basically it. I do agree about something about producing creative work, and what I do find is that a lot of channelers did their jobs before they changed their profession to being channeling, and they started professional channelers, involved some kind of creative work, ostensibly. So they were a graphic designer. So one of them composed music sheets for kindergartens. One of them was in advertising. But in reality, they find out that the job is not as creative as they thought it would be. So, and they were frustrated by that. That was one of the reasons for the life crisis. So I see some kind of affinity. I'm not exactly sure why. But I agree there's something there.
I would like to raise a question concerning this term of self-reliance. Did you meet the term self-redemption? Then what about the sources of this concept of a self-reliant redemption or coping with your questions? And finally, what happens to this concept of self-reliance if the experiences are awful? So it should be just a good thing to do it by yourself.
Yes. Well, it is self-redemption, but in the sense, they would not call it self-redemption. They would call it I'm talking about, again, contemporary channeling. They wouldn't call it self-reliance because it's very much akin to the middle-class ethos of self-reliance. You should basically manage your own life, be in charge of your own life, take responsibility for your own failures, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily with religious undertones. But for channelers, it does have religious undertones. And I think for middle class, it does, well, at least if you go through Weber's path, it does have religious undertones anyhow. And I think that's, I don't want to go into it too deeply, but there's a lot of affinity between neoliberal discourse and channeling and New Age discourse. There's a lot, and the difference, if it's a difference, is that concepts, that's why I said that some of their concepts were shattered and some of their concepts were new, because some were not. What happens is that a lot of stuff they believed in before starts glowing with a religious light, so to speak. It doesn't mean that there's no change in point of view, but it's not a revolution. And that, I think, why they downplay the parts that are not about self-reliance and not about self-redemption. And they're about things that come from outside, scary things that tell you scary messages. I didn't go into that, but a lot of the content of the first messages is not optimistic content. And New Age channeling brings through very optimistic, bright messages about this is not the case in the first instance. And I think that's why they turn to, and they kind of ignore the part about not self-reliance, because it would, for most of them, require too dramatic a change in worldview. But my sample is skewed because I went to the people who chose channeling. I'm not saying that everybody, assuming this wild, cultivated thing works outside of channeling, and I don't know, you have to check that. Assuming it works, it doesn't mean that cultivated, if you chose cultivated channeling, you went for self-reliance. Ostensibly, people who had such a vision went in other directions as well. But I didn't interview those people. Okay?
1, 2, and that's probably it.
Thank you for fascinating endeavor, as always. I wanted to ask, maybe following the last question, how much is this reluctance or this dialectics that you are portraying, how far is that from ethoses which are part of a wider sociology there? I mean, in the sense of, you were talking a bit about the extreme individualism of neoliberalism and so on and so forth, but there's also other sorts of individuation which are part of modernity, and for example large powers that play on you, and this kind of a dialectics between your individuation and your, I don't know, becoming a part of greater systems, greater and so on, is I think a tension which one can find also outside the world of channeling. So maybe you can say something about that.
Okay.
And the fact that you don't want to recognize it, but you're still in advertising. Most people don't leave their jobs, so in that sense.
No, but the people I spoke with actually left their jobs.
Yeah.
But most people don't. And a lot of people do channeling without leaving. It's like a day job or a night job, so to speak. But when I first started writing about channeling, I thought it was a pretty decent metaphor for what Ulrich Beck calls second modernity. And the reason I like Beck's term over those of Bauman or Giddens is that Beck says it's not necessarily true that social structures have become less powerful today. But the narrative is The discourse is that they have become less powerful today. You're not supposed to talk about them. And I thought, well, that's like channeling. In the sense that you're talking about self-reliance, but you're doing it through an outside authority. Being an anthropologist, later on, I thought that this is kind of imposing. It's kind of saying you're having a mystical experience. What you're doing is a metaphor of social phenomena. And I felt kind of reluctant to say that, because I want to listen to what they say. But I'm reluctant about that, so to speak, but I think there's something there, too.
In the sense that discursively, this is one of the breaches.
Yes.
Right? This, I don't know, reluctance, which is... repressed, exactly. That its repressment is exactly the moment of breach in the discourse that you would look for.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, last question.
You said that contemporary Israeli channelers are not very interested in who is speaking.
Yes.
Did you find any discourse on or reflections on what's going on? Questions like, is it the higher self or an external entity or the subconscious or something like that?
Surprisingly, almost nothing. The first book I purchased when I started channeling, not yet.
That's okay. Lapsus. No confessions.
Was this encyclopedia about angels, because the first channeler I interviewed did angels. And the first published work in Hebrew, original in Hebrew, was the angel Raphael. So I said, excellent, angels, and I started reading this, and I started talking with the channel. I said, I told someone this. I went to a channel lecture, and the channeler said, the room is full of cherubs and angels and seraphs. And later I interviewed her and I asked, what's the difference between cherubs and angels and seraphs? And she says, I don't know. And I said, well, you said. She said, well, that's what came to my mind at the moment. That was what I was channeling. I said, are you not interested? And she says, no, I'm not interested. What is of interest is if it works. It's a utilitarian ethos in the sense that if it works, it's good. They are unmetaphysical to an extreme sense, in the sense that they're not interested in metaphysics. There are a few single exceptions. People who are interested in metaphysics, especially one single Israeli channeler who writes a lot, very interesting person, slightly different background, and he's not from a middle-class background, he's from a lower middle-class background. And he's really interested in metaphysics. He incorporates it into some of his, or the entities incorporated into some of his books. And he told me he's so frustrated because his clients are not interested at all. Because they just want to hear about self-empowerment, self-empowerment, self-empowerment. I want to tell them, there's this battle between good and evil going on in the cosmos, and we're just pawns. And they say, stop right there, I'm no pawn. And so he keeps giving them the same thing, and he's really frustrated. He says, this is my best work. This is my life work. This is why I was brought here, to talk about this battle. And nobody wants to listen. If I want to make a living, I have to keep telling them this American version of channeling and not what I'm... But he's an exception. He's really an exception in this sense.
All right. Thank you very much.